Representative Stephanie Barnard. She's with us tonight, and she'll have a few words for us after the presentation. Just a couple things to introduce this program. They gave me a script to read. This is from Washington Humanities, and there are a couple things they wanted us to know. First of all, Humanities Washington is a nonprofit organization dedicated to sparking conversation and critical thinking. And it provides many other cultural programs to hundreds of thousands of people throughout Washington each year. Thanks to support from the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Washington Secretary of State, the Thomas S. Foley Institute for Public Policy and Public Service at Washington State University, and generous private donors, Humanities Washington Speakers Bureau presenters visit all corners of the state. You can visit their website at humanities.org and find all kinds of different talks and lectures that are being presented all across the state. There is a suggestion by the Humanities Washington Speakers Bureau that we keep civil discourse. I suspect that our conversation tonight we shouldn't worry about that too much at all, but I haven't been to Amanda's lecture before, so we'll see. Speaking of Amanda, Dr. Amanda Van Lannen is a professor of history at Lewis Clark State College and the author of Washington Apples, Orchards, and the Development of Industrial Agriculture. She earned a PhD in history at Washington State University and blogs about food history at historyreheated.com. Very good. had to read that one carefully. Of course, my name is Jason Worf. I happen to be the pastor of the church that's hosting this program, and just really glad that you're here tonight. And without further ado, and I should say, you are welcome. There are some snacks in the back. You can wait till afterwards, or if you get really hungry, you can quietly get up and grab some during the talk. And Amanda, the time is yours.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me. Can everyone hear me okay? All right, excellent. So my parents are actually right there in the back, if you don't know them. So hopefully they won't make too many weird faces at me, because I can't trust this one back here to not make weird faces at me while I'm doing this. So I write about the apple industry in Washington State. My book, The Washington Apple, goes into a lot more detail about this. So if you have questions about anything I talk about tonight, let me know. We'll do a little Q&A at the end, because I know a lot more than what I'm going to talk about up here in this hour tonight. So when I got started on this project, my big question was, why Washington? Why are apples grown here? How many of you have had Red Delicious apples from the grocery store? What happens when you bite into those? Not delicious. Not delicious. I've had audiences members say wet cardboard. They're not good. So when I was a kid growing up, my parents were missionaries. We lived in Saipan, and we could get apples in our grocery store, the Red Delicious apples. Saipan, tiny little island, 3,000 miles out in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, and they were gross. And I didn't understand what people thought, like why people thought apples were so amazing, because those were the only apples I had ever had. At the same time, the fact that we had those apples in our little island grocery store year-round is pretty darn amazing. There's some big things that have to happen with logistics for that to happen. So that really made me curious to learn more. When I moved up to Washington after college, I did actually have apples that tasted good finally. You get them right out of the orchard, and they are really quite good. Much different than some of those grocery store apples. Washington is the top apple producing state in the nation. It has been since the 1920s, when it surpassed New York State to become the #1 apple producing state in the nation. Today, apples are the top agricultural commodity in the state. They're an over $2 billion industry. Apples are huge. In fact, I had a job interview in Georgia several years ago, and they had just had a local apple festival, and the people interviewing me told me that the baskets they passed out at the festival were full of Washington apples. So that's the kind of reach we have in this state. Anyone want to guess what percentage of the nation's apples Washington grows? 60, 70. Between 60 and 70, most years it's a little closer to 70, so it's a big deal. Now, if we look at the number of apple trees, just as this was becoming a big industry in the state in 1917, there was a lot of apple trees. Am I not working?
There's a little bit of click, and I think it's the headset.
Is that better if I move my earring? Maybe
I don't know, maybe.
Okay.
Talk for a minute.
Is that better? If we look at the number of apple trees in 1917 as this industry is getting started, I live in Asotin County, over 37,000 trees, and we are proud of our orchard heritage in Asotin County. That's a lot of trees. But if we look at Benton County here, whoa, right? Even more trees. And then we look at Chelan County and Yakima County. What is going on, Central Washington? Now, when I give this talk back east, everyone thinks, oh, Washington's the evergreen state. In fact, my publisher tried to shoehorn evergreen state into the title of my book. I was like, no. You don't understand. That's not Eastern Washington. That's not what it's like out here. So when people think apples, right, they think lush pastoral landscapes and all the apple trees. They don't think about places like where we actually live that are actually deserts. So that kind of adds to the question, why Washington? All of the major primary growing districts in the state are east of the Cascades, in places that get as little as 10 inches of rain a year. This is not a landscape that you would look at and say, hey, let's grow apples there. Right? And yet someone did, and here we are. So how did we get to this point? And that's what I want to talk about tonight, because it has a lot to do with bigger factors that were happening in the United States. We have several things going on. We have more people moving to cities, which means there's fewer and fewer farmers. And that means there's now big urban markets to buy produce. We'll talk a little bit about how railroads are instrumental in this, and also irrigation. But to understand how we get to this point, we have to back up a little bit. Apples originally come from Kazakhstan, which is in Asia, and they were brought to Europe, and as American settlers came to this continent, they brought their favorite apples with them. So I'm going to use a sciencey word here. Apples are heterozygous, and that just means that when you plant an apple seed, you are rolling the genetic dice. You do not know what you're going to get. You're going to get something very different than the seeds those came. Just lose me? Okay. You're going to get something very different than the seeds that apple came from. So you might get seeds from a red apple. It might grow a tree that has green apples or yellow apples. They could be different sizes, those different flavors. Literally hundreds of thousands of varieties of apples in the world, because every time you plant an apple seed, you get a new variety. Now, not all of these are great for eating, but when people found one that they really liked, they wanted to duplicate it. And the only way to duplicate it is to cut a graft. And this is very ancient knowledge. The Romans knew how to graft, the Greeks knew how to graft. And so when people were bringing trees to North America, they brought their favorite grafted varieties so that they could replicate that. And so from the very beginning, we have accounts going back to colonial New England and colonial Virginia. Settlers are talking about their apples. It's a very strong connection with home. Every single farm has an orchard. And those orchards, besides being a feeling of home, they serve a really important purpose for food. You can do a lot of things with apples. You can eat them, you can dry them, you can turn them into vinegar. For many Americans in the 17 and 1800s, you turned them into apple cider, by which I mean hard cider. People would turn their hogs loose in their apple orchards at the end of the season to fatten up their hogs before butchering time. A lot of different purposes. As people moved west, they kept bringing apples with them. You all may have heard of Johnny Appleseed. Yeah, some of you may remember the Disney cartoon. That's the one I remember. Johnny Appleseed was a real person. His name was John Chapman, and he was very much mythologized in the 19th century. Later in his life, he converted to Swedenborgianism and became a missionary for that denomination, gave up his earthly possessions, and went around the countryside giving away religious tracts and apple seeds. But before that, he was a nurseryman. He owned property in what is today Ohio and Indiana, and he grew apple trees. Now, this is important because in order to prove a land claim in the Old Northwest, what is today Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, you had to plant at least 50 apple or pear trees. That's how you proved your land claim. So either you need to get your hands on some apple seeds, or better yet, you go to a guy like John Chapman, and you go to his nursery, and you buy saplings that give you a head start. Because literally what you are doing is going to the land agent and pointing at that tree and saying, I planted that. I have been here as long as I say I have been. So critically important for a number of reasons, for feeling of home, for food, for land ownership. Now here in the Northwest, the very first apple tree was planted at Fort Vancouver sometime in the 1820s. We don't know exactly when, but sometime in the 1820s. That tree died during the first summer of the pandemic, and when I went to Vancouver last spring, they told me that it has sprung back to life. It is now sprouting new shoots from the roots. So some people told me it was alive, and some people told me it wasn't. I don't know exactly, but it's growing something from the roots still. Fort Vancouver was an outpost for the Hudson's Bay Company. Hudson's Bay Company was a major fur trading company in North America, and they had a little bit of a problem. The men who worked at Fort Vancouver did not like native foods, hated salmon, didn't want to eat roots. The company was spending tons of money shipping flour around the tip of South America to Fort Vancouver. In fact, one winter, the men at Hudson's Bay Company butchered 600 horses to use for meat. This is not sustainable. This is costing so much money. And so John McLaughlin, who's the chief factor at the fort, has an idea. What if we grow our own food? That'll solve part of our problem. Hudson's Bay Company had tried this at one of their outposts in the Midwest, and it had been successful. So his superiors say, why not? Try a farm. McLaughlin writes off to the London Horticultural Society for a vast array of seeds. Different kinds of alfalfa, wheat, different grain, vegetables, all kinds of fruits. Plants them at Fort Vancouver, and what do you know? Super successful. Things grow like crazy in that part of the world. Now, the story of the tree, it's a very sweet romantic story. I don't know if it's true, but I'm telling anyway. So the story goes that there was a young man who was getting ready to leave London and come to Fort Vancouver. And they were giving a farewell dinner in his honor. And he was seated next to a beautiful young lady, and there was fruit at the end of the meal. And she took seeds from her apples and wrapped them up in her handkerchief and tucked them in his lapel pocket and said, remember me when you get to Oregon. Fast forward however many weeks it takes him to get there, and he finds those seeds in his jacket pocket, and they plant them, thus giving birth to the fruit industry in the Northwest. It's beautiful. Now, did it actually happen? Maybe, maybe not. We do know that Narcissa Whitman, one of the first missionaries to come to the Northwest, she records this story in her diary in 1836. So that does tell us that the story was being told very early on. But we also know that McLaughlin got seeds from a lot of other sources. So, jury's out on that one, but it's still a great foundational story, right? So, McLaughlin proves that things grow well in the Northwest. He's very generous with his garden. He gives cuttings of the trees to Henry and Eliza Spalding, missionaries at Lapway. He gives cuttings to the Whitmans, missionaries in Walla Walla. He gives cuttings to people who move up into Puget Sound and people who move down into the Willamette Valley. And so this tree is spreading. But the first grafted tree in the Northwest was brought in 1848 by a guy named Henderson Lewing. Now, Henderson Lewing was from a long line of nurserymen. This is something his family had been doing for several generations. They had moved from North Carolina to Illinois, to Iowa, establishing nurseries each time they moved. And Lewing decided he was going to move to the Oregon Territory. He built 2 wagons. We don't know exactly what they look like. This is one artist's rendering, in which he put over 700 saplings to bring across on the Oregon Trail, along with his wife, his pregnant wife, and 9 children. People thought he was crazy. People kept trying to stop him and say, "You are never going to get these over the Rockies. They're all going to die." In fact, someone had tried it earlier and had lost all the trees trying to cross South Pass in Wyoming. But Henderson Lewing must have been a really stubborn guy, because he didn't listen to anyone, and he kept going. And he made it to Oregon with most of his trees. And his brother followed him very quickly. They established one of the first nurseries, or the first nursery in the Northwest, near what is today Milwaukie, Oregon. And they were in high demand. People wanted fruit, people wanted trees. It takes a few years for trees to produce fruit. So by the time they plant these trees and they start producing fruit, the gold rush has started. So Henderson and his brother get the bright idea: let's pack up some of our apples, take them down to Sacramento, and sell them to the miners. So they pack up 2 wooden crates, band them with iron so no one can steal the fruit, ship them down to Sacramento, where they promptly sell out for $80 a pound. Everybody in Oregon gets apple fever then. We got some miners with some gold dust burn holes in their pockets. So for a short time, this becomes very lucrative. Henderson Lewing, though, he decides to relocate to California, because why am I shipping these apples when I could just grow them near the mines? So Henderson Lewing will eventually relocate, and he will establish the apple orchard in Watsonville, California, which is still a very prominent apple growing region in California today. One of his brothers will establish the grape industry in Napa Valley, and a third brother stays here in Oregon and develops the Bing cherry. So these 3 guys have very deep fruit roots in the Northwest. So we have grafted trees. People all over the state are growing trees. Most people are still farmers. So every corner of Washington Territory and then Washington State have trees. There's a booming orchard industry in Vashon Island and Orcas Island, supplying growing urban areas of Seattle and Tacoma. Walla Walla at one point has the largest apple orchard in the country, Dr. Nelson Blaylock's orchard, which is over 500 acres, again, supplying miners in Idaho. But those things come and go. Kind of a boom and bust cycle, depending on how many people you have to sell apples to. Because let's face it, apples are delicious, but there's only so many we can eat, right? So why Washington? Apples are literally growing everywhere in the country. At this point, we are now at about 1900. New York is the leading apple producing state in the nation. New York has been growing apples commercially since at least the 1840s. They've got a lock on the market. They're close to New York City and Boston and Philadelphia and all of those big urban areas back east. So what makes a little western upstart like Washington think we can even compete with that? Well, there's a few reasons. First off, the railroads build across central Washington. The Northern Pacific completes its line in 1885. The Great Northern completes its line in 1893. Railroads are looking to make money, and they make money by hauling things. So what kind of crops, what kind of industry can we develop so that we have something to haul on our lines? I did a lot of research with both of these railroads' records. There's over 20,000 cubic feet of archival material for these railroads in St. Paul, Minnesota. They've got forklifts in the back. It's great. Thankfully, it's not all apples, or otherwise I'd still be there. But they have all of these departments investigating different Western industries. Timber, mining, wheat, fishing, fruit, ranching. Pick a Western industry, I guarantee you there's a railroad in back of it somewhere, because they are looking to make investments and they are looking to make money. They're also looking to sell real estate. The Northern Pacific had land grants that it was looking to sell. The Great Northern didn't have land grants, but they had their finger in a bunch of land deals, and were also trying to make money on real estate. And so as they're looking over their lines, they're looking to see which areas are best suited for which industry. Now, wheat, you're not going to compete with the Palouse. The Palouse is some of the best wheat-growing country in the world. Not going to compete there. Western Washington has timber, coal, fishing, all kinds of things going on. What are we going to do with Central Washington? What can we do here that's profitable in this area that's a desert? Well, it turns out if you put water on the land here, it's really fertile. So if we can figure out a way to irrigate the land, then we can grow something, but we have to be really selective about what we grow because it has to be something we can make a profit on, because irrigation is expensive and transportation is expensive. In fact, when we started growing apples in Washington, a consumer in New York City would pay 3 times as much for a Washington apple than they would for an apple grown in New York. So we've got a couple problems. How do we find a crop that we can make money on? And how do we convince consumers to pay that much money for our crop? Okay. Apples are the thing they landed on because they're perishable, but they're not too perishable. Given the technology at the time, at this point, iced refrigerator cars, you could get a load of apples back to New York City, and they'd be fine. You're not going to get a load of cherries or a load of peaches back to New York City in 1905 with the technology that existed at the time. So both of these railroads start encouraging fruit culture, apples in particular, and the Great Northern really goes all in on apples up in Wenatchee. Wenatchee almost is exclusively growing apples. Yakima and this neck of the woods is growing a lot more variety of fruit, but that's why they chose it. So the railroads start advertising this to people. There are hundreds of these types of advertisements and brochures put out by the railroads, but also put out by local chambers of commerce to try to get people to move to Central Washington. And you can see this one from the Northern Pacific. This is from 1911. Literally a quarter mile of red apples, right? You can see that bounty. 21,000 income in 1 year. This is at a time when the average American income is $5,000 a year. Yeah, that's some big money. This is really marketed at middle-class individuals. So you're a doctor, you're a lawyer, you're a store owner. Are you tired of the rat race? Do you want to regain your health? Make a healthy, safe life for your children? Come to Washington, start an apple farm. It's easy, anyone can do it. You will literally pick dollars off of trees. This is actually a slogan they used in Wenatchee, where dollars grow on trees. This is the favorite of mine of all of the brochures I found. And as folks often point out, this is a guy dressed, he looks like he's maybe getting ready to go to a business meeting or something, right? He doesn't look like he should be out picking apples. He's got his nice suit on. He's got his wife and his daughter there. Everything looks green and healthy and great. So this is the vision that is sold to people. Now, we all live here. We can all imagine, right, that the reality of this was a little bit different. We don't actually know the failure rate. The historian John Fahey estimates that 75% of people who bought apple land in Central Washington failed. Unfortunately, he did not cite a source for that information, so I wasn't able to track down a footnote. There were a lot of people that failed. Because imagine, if you're a lawyer giving up your practice in Detroit, what do you know about growing apples? What do you know about any of this? And you don't just have to grow apples, you also have to irrigate. And here's the other problem. You've bought land that you've told has irrigation water, but they actually haven't finished the irrigation canal yet. So you're kind of in a bind. That happened to a lot of people. So all of these kind of growing pains, getting the irrigation infrastructure built, people having the knowledge. A lot of people didn't know what they were doing. And so Washington State College had to kind of step in with the research scientists and educate people. In fact, we have an account from Roscoe Scheller, who wrote his memoirs. He grew up in Sunnyside. And he said the first time the agricultural agent came out to his dad's orchard and helped him prune, his dad was horrified. He's like, "What are you doing? You're cutting my trees all down." And the agent's like, no, you have to do this because you have to, if you don't prune it, you're not going to get big fruit. You're going to grow all these tiny little apples and you won't be able to sell them. So lots of accounts of that. People really struggling to pick up the knowledge they need, people struggling to make a go of it. But if you do make a go of it, you've got some decisions you need to make. First of all, you got to decide what kind of apple trees you're going to plant, because there are hundreds of varieties being grown commercially. And there's a lot of things you have to consider. Flavor, how well they're going to ship, do they do well in our climate? Very early on, the State Department of Horticulture encouraged people to kind of limit yourselves. Let's pick 5 or 6 that we're really good at and focus on those. But in the early years, people are growing everything. In fact, there was one pack house manager in Yakima who claimed to be able to identify over 200 varieties by sight. I don't know if he could, but he claimed he could. So this is part of the struggle. One of the apples that they initially grew was called a Ben Davis. It had a really tough skin, and it would ship really well because it had that thick skin. Every single grower account I read said, oh, I don't eat Ben Davis. They're gross. I ship those. I have my own variety that we eat at home. So we're already starting to see in these early years this consideration that it's not just how good an apple tastes, but there's other factors like can it ship without getting bruised that start to affect the decisions people are making and what they're planting as they're establishing these farms. Now remember I said apples in New York cost 3 times as much? We got to figure out how to convince people to pay more money. It's an apple. What do we do to an apple to make it worth more money? Well, one of the things that growers in Washington adopt are pesticides. Growers in New York are not using pesticides yet. Pesticide usage is not widespread in agriculture at this time. But this is one of the ways we can add value to our apples. So if you're a consumer and you go to your grocer in New York, you might have a worm in your apple. If you're buying an apple from Washington, no worms. That's a difference. So codling moth were the big thing that they had to worry about. These things can lay 3 to 4 broods of eggs per season. They lay their eggs on the fruit, and then the worms hatch and eat the fruit. We get rid of them by spraying pesticides. Now, in the early years, growers tried everything. I saw accounts of people spraying tobacco juice, sour milk, sulfur. The thing that they finally figured out worked was lead arsenate. Now, yes, people back then knew that lead and arsenic were toxic, but that's the thing that killed the worms. And if you're going to sell our apples at a high enough price to make a profit, we've got to kill the worms. So for growers in central Washington, this was very much a necessary evil. They did it because that's how they were going to stay competitive in the market. And again, this is something that is not happening back east in New York. By the time growers in New York kind of figure out, maybe we should start adopting some of these practices, it's not just pesticides, there's other pruning techniques and planting techniques and different varieties and things that Washington growers are adopting. That's the latest science. By the time New York growers kind of start figuring out, hey, this little upstart state, they're gaining on us. Maybe we should make some changes. By then it's too late. By then Washington has come to dominate the market. So this does run into problems though. Again, people know arsenic and lead are poison. And this came to a head in 1925 and 1926. The US did not have limits on how much arsenic could be in food, but Great Britain did. And 80% of apple exports at this time went to Great Britain. In 1925, reports start showing up that there are apples in Great Britain with like 100 times excess the amount of arsenic allowed by British law. People are getting scared. It's showing up in the newspapers. Now, growers in America, they say, well, this isn't a problem. The wind blows it off. The rain washes it off. We don't get rain out here. Someone seemed to forgot to mention that. But nature takes care of it. This shouldn't be a problem. But as apples kept showing up in Great Britain with high levels of arsenic, the British threatened to ban American imports, which was a problem, pretty significant portion of the export market. But also we start to see headlines in America, in the New York Times and other major papers about arsenic in apples. Well, now suddenly we have to worry about our American consumers as well, being worried about these dangerous pesticides in their food. So what growers, in cooperation with the state colleges, had to figure out was how to get the arsenic levels off the fruit. What they eventually came up with were these brush wipers. They would run the apples through a 3% hydrochloric acid solution and then run them through these brush wipers, and that got enough of the arsenic off where they could sell them in Britain. That still doesn't solve our problem of getting rid of the moths. They continued to use lead arsenate into the 1950s. That was replaced with DDT. They used DDT until that was banned. And since the 1970s, they've been using a variety of things, pheromone traps, other types of pesticides, because this is still a major issue in agriculture. How do we control these things? Because consumers don't want to see worms coming out of their fruit when they cut it open. So we've grown a perfect looking apple. We've picked a pretty variety. This is how the Red Delicious got picked, because it was that pretty red color. Now we focus on packaging and marketing. This is not something they are doing in New York either. Here in Washington, we packed in apple boxes, partly because we didn't have hardwoods for barrels. Traditionally, barrels were what apples were packed in. We packed in boxes. Each apple was a uniform size and wrapped in tissue paper. So it's this beautiful little gift you get to open from the grocery store every time. And we've got this lovely real estate on the box where we can advertise. At this time, growers in New York were still packing in barrels. The advice for packing your apple barrel in 1910 was that you squish the apples down until you see juice running out the bottom of the barrel, and then you hammer the lid on. So I just think of that consumer in 1910 walking into my grocery store. Here is this beautiful Washington apple. No worms, no bruises, no like gunky juice from those other squished apples. It's lovely. Or I can pick something out of this barrel. I might be willing to pay 3 times as much money for that Washington apple, I think. That's not so gross looking. And in fact, I came across an account from a fruit grower's journal from about 1913. And the guy was complaining about all of the upstart Western producers, all of the great fruit and vegetables that were coming out of the West. He's like, oh man, used to be consumers would be happy with shriveled up turnips in February. Now they want all this fresh stuff that they're growing out west. He wasn't too happy about it. He must have been the guy selling the shriveled up turnips. So advertising is something that Washington growers also undertake, and this is not something that growers in New York do. Again, apples grow everywhere. We have to charge more, and we don't have a lot of markets locally. So we are marketing to people we have never met. New York City was kind of the gold standard of where they pitched everything toward. Think of that consumer in New York City. And so we have to convince them to buy our apples. Now again, New York was very late to this. New York growers thought we were crazy, that we could charge so much for packing our apples and putting these colorful labels on them. They thought that was just a scam, because it's not a healthier apple. It's the same apple as what we're growing, these upstart Westerners. But the advertising was effective. One of the best-known brands was the Skookum Indian. This was created by the Northwest Fruit Exchange in 1916. And they use this in a variety of advertisements. Now, there are 2 strategies for advertising. The strategy that the Northwest Fruit Exchange took was to advertise directly to consumers. The other strategy is to advertise to wholesalers, because this is a time before we have chain grocery stores. So typically, what would happen is you would go to a city, there would be a broker who would buy a carload of fruit and then sell that to all the mom and pop grocery stores. So the idea here is you're going to see this advertisement. This is in Good Housekeeping from 1921. You're going to see this advertisement. You're going to go to your local mom and pop grocery store and say, I want to buy a Skookum apple. And hopefully they're going to say, here, we have a box of them in. And if they don't, then they're going to find out how to get a box. magazine advertisements, cookbooks. They had little Skookum dolls you could send away for. I have a coloring book that you could send away for as a premium. Apple cores, all kinds of things to try to advertise. And brands. Everybody wanted their own brand. Everyone wanted to kind of put their own stamp on it. So there were individuals who had brands, but then there were also the cooperatives like Big Y or Blue Ribbon or Blue Goose, where growers worked together to help market their fruit. So the Northern Pacific Railroad did a survey of consumers in the mid-1920s at a time when there were over 200 brands of Washington apples. And they wanted to see if consumers could recognize any brands. Most of the people they interviewed, when they asked, what kind of apples do you buy? They were like, the red ones? I don't know. Okay? But 15% of consumers could name Skookum. And a significant percentage of consumers could name these 3 other brands as well. So clearly these big Washington brands were making some kind of impression on Eastern consumers that they could remember that. There were some other crazy gimmicky things they tried early on as well to try to advertise Washington as the apple state. One of my favorites is the National Apple Show. This was something started in 1908 in Spokane. This was supposed to be a national apple fair where you could exhibit anything from a plate with 3 apples on it all the way to the big prize, the 630-box carload prize. This is how many apples could fit on a boxcar at the time. This show was pretty much doomed from the beginning. It was co-sponsored by the Great Northern Railroad the first year. Growers in central Washington really couldn't understand why Spokane was hosting this, because Spokane didn't grow nearly as many apples as they did. And so they were really skeptical about participating. There were arguments over the rules, because each growing section in Washington had their own grading standards, so the calls of unfairness. And the big scandal was the carload prize. Mr. Gilbert of Yakima packed his apple car like normal. He used his regular crew of pickers to put together their exhibit. Mr. Horan in Wenatchee hired a crack crew of pickers and took 3 months to individually select the apples for his boxcar. Mr. Horan won. Wenatchee had a big celebration, had a big bonfire, they had a great time. Folks in Wenatchee cried foul. They didn't follow the rules. Of course, there was nothing in the rules that said you couldn't do this, but they thought it was unfair. So there was so much squabbling that the president of the Great Northern Railroad, Lewis Hill, he wants out of this. So he says to Howard Elliott, the president of the Northern Pacific, "Hey, Howard, why don't we take turns? You do it next year, I'll do it the year after, we'll just swap it around." Not surprisingly, Howard Elliott got stuck with this thing until it was over. There was no more swapping. Lots of infighting, and by the end, Howard Elliott he just threw his hands up and he said something to the effect of, "There's never been so many problems with apples since the Garden of Eden with Eve and the apple. I can't deal with these people." It was always very regional, always very local. By the end, it was basically just a fun fair weekend. But it was an attempt to try to bring that stature. The thing that was much more successful was National Apple Week, and this started in 1920. This was much looser. Basically, the International Apple Shippers Association kept a log of what everyone did. So you choose your own adventure, you pick what you want to do, and you celebrate during the last week of October, culminating in Halloween. Good time for apple bobbing. So things like store display windows, like this one from a hardware store in Yakima. The railroads would give away thousands of apples, and they'd put them in little fancy printed cartons with information about Washington State. At one point, silent film stars came to Wenatchee to make a film about apples in Washington, so that was a pretty big deal. The railroads, as I said, were a big part of this, and they would feature apples on their menus during Apple Week. The Northern Pacific, their signature dish was a great big baked potato, which is right, you can see it's quite large. They did that to promote potatoes in southern Idaho. So during Apple Week, they would do a great big baked apple. So for 10 cents, you could get that on their menu. My absolute favorite of all the promotions happened in 1927 in Yakima. Folks in Yakima almost didn't celebrate Apple Week because this was right after the arsenic scare and people weren't feeling too optimistic. But somebody in town said, we should do something big this year. What if we make a big apple cake? And somebody said, cake? It's got to be pie, right? What's more American than apple pie? So they decided to build this big pie, 4 tons of apples that were pre-cooked at the local Libby McNeil cannery. The pie was 10 feet in diameter, specially constructed knife, rolling pins. The oven that they had built to bake this thing in collapsed the night before the event. So any of you that have ever had to run an event know this probably caused some heartburn for those folks organizing this, but they figured something out. All of the news cameras were there to film the occasion, and it went off beautifully until the next day when someone on the AP wires made a mistake and attributed the event to Seattle. So they had to get that corrected. But aside from that little glitch, it went off like a charm. So folks in Washington really embracing the apple, really finding ways to celebrate the apple. And as I said, by 1920s, Washington was the primary apple growing state. We were largely marketing to people in eastern cities, and we had fundamentally changed what people thought about apples. Instead of the apple that you get from your friend's orchard or from that apple barrel that's sticky and wormy, consumers had now come to expect something that looks more like this. Uniform color, perfect shape, everything the same size, everything kind of industrialized, right? The king of fruits. And so that change made a big difference in how Americans eat. Apples, of course, are still very important today. When I would look at sources from like the 20s, they were worried about like bananas being imported, Bananas are going to take over apple as the king of fruit. Today, we've got a lot more food choices. And so it's not just bananas, right? It's any variety of things that we can purchase at a grocery store or a gas station or anywhere we go that can compete with apples. Excuse me. Any questions? I think there's a lot we can learn about how food changed and how our state had a really important role in that. Yeah.
So I was thinking about the dams, our local dams, and the Dust Bowl area, and how we were able to utilize the dams, and our irrigation made it much easier for us to turn this valley in the ground that is so fertile to blossom as a rose, as they say. So curious about when the Grand Coulee was built and how that affected our apple farming.
So that came a little bit later. Grand Coulee was constructed during the Great Depression, and I believe it was 45 when it was finally finished, yeah, and then it was early 50s before the Columbia Basin Project came online, and that really has changed. A lot of the apple production has moved east of the Columbia River into those really high density plantings that are watered by water from that Columbia Basin Project. So just kind of shifting where we were able to have production. Of course, even in these early years, that was Rufus Woods, who was the newspaper editor of the Wenatchee Daily World. He was one of the big promoters of Grand Coulee because he really wanted that irrigation to open up more of central Washington for settlement. So that came after Washington was already the #1 apple producing state and just made us even more prominent in that regard.
So we have the statement is it's as American as apple pie. Where did that come from?
From an advertisement for men's suits that was first published in 1924, believe it or not. I just wrote a blog post about this. That idea of the apple and apple pie being American was much deeper in the culture, and we see a lot of references to that. Now, in the 1800s, some of the references to Americanness and apple pie are actually more in reference to corrupt politicians, because you wouldn't have had fresh apple pie at the 4th of July, you would have had a dried apple pie. And that dried apple pie may or may not have been good. I found a lot of sources in the 1800s kind of ragging on boarding house pies and how terrible they were. But especially by the time we get to World War I, that's when we really see a positive connection with apple pie and Americanness. Troops on the home front coming home from France and having apple pie and feeling patriotic and feeling like, I'm home. And then that exact phrase first being used in an advertisement for men's suits in 1924. Yeah.
There was a question that actually came in on our Facebook post before the event. And Jesse says, I hope that you mentioned Grady Auville. I don't know if you know who Grady Auville is or what his connection is to apples.
I know the name. I know he's a big apple grower, but that's all I can remember right now.
Fair enough. All right.
So you mentioned that Red Delicious was a very popular apple variety. Now we're getting hit with Cosmic Crisp. What is the driver for the #1 apple variety?
So that's a great question. So the Cosmic Crisp, developed by Washington State University, one of the big drivers is that consumers have been complaining that the Red Delicious don't taste good. And so we've kind of had a shift in what consumers want from something that looks pretty to where we actually want something that tastes good. And so when they were developing the Cosmic Crisp, they used the Honey Crisp as kind of their model for flavor. I actually got to chat with the person who ran the taste tests for the Cosmic Crisp. They did them at the mall in Spokane because they thought that'd be a good slice of American, the American people. They said right at harvest, they were neck and neck. But after about 4 months in storage, people preferred the Cosmic Crisp. So they're still looking not just for flavor, but how well does it store? Because in controlled atmosphere storage, they can store them for up to a year. And so making sure that the flavor profiles are going to hold up long term, and consumers are still going to be happy with flavor.
So this is just piggybacks off of her question. Was there a I don't know how to ask this, because I don't think Red Delicious are very good. I don't think they've ever been good. So has the apple changed, or has it just that we've gotten so many other varieties that are better that now we don't, or has it always,
I think
why was it called Red Delicious? Was it ever really delicious?
It was delicious, and that's why it was called delicious. It was what they call a bud sport mutation. So it was like a branch on another tree that was growing a different type of apple from what the rest of the tree was growing. And it was discovered by Stark Brothers Nurseries in Missouri. And apparently when he took a bite of that, he was like, this is delicious, hence the name. Part of the trouble with the Red Delicious is they're really finicky about storage. And so I've heard from folks that if you have one fresh, like right off the tree, they are really still good. The problem is if they're not stored properly, they get that texture problem. And again, in that year-long controlled atmosphere storage, the flavor doesn't hold up.
I remember when I was a kid, my mom would buy the bag of small apples, and that's what my sister and I got to eat. And then she would get these big Red Delicious apples, and we weren't allowed to eat them because they were for my dad's lunches.
He may have gotten the short end of the stick.
We did.
What is the best conditions for storing apples? Temperature and moisture and all that stuff.
They do need to be kept cool. Historically, when they would do iced warehouses, they would try to keep them around 40 to 50 degrees. I'm not sure what they do in controlled atmosphere storage or what the exact levels are for humidity and that. But for those who don't know, controlled atmosphere storage has been used since the 1950s, and they basically suck all the oxygen out of, it's an enclosed chamber, they suck all the oxygen out. And so that's what allows them to store the fruit for up to a year. But that's something that wasn't really used widely until the 50s and 60s. Yeah.
When we were raising kids and it's been a while now, but I always went out to the farms and brought home Criterion apples. They were the size of a grapefruit. Three of them would make a 12-inch pie. They were wonderful. You can't even find them now. They're gone. They're just gone. We moved in the 80s. We moved back to the South and lived on the East Coast. We were there 6 years, and when we came back, apples had completely changed. We didn't have the same kind of apples at all. And I kept going in looking for Golden Delicious. They weren't around as much. They're still around some, but not at all like they were at one time.
Yeah, and that's again part of chasing like what consumers want. So they're always trying to chase the next trend and figure out what's going to get people to eat more apples. Unfortunately, what that has meant is we've lost some of those older varieties. There is a retired FBI agent, David Benscotter, who lives in Pullman, and he's part of the Lost Apple Project, and they have been going around the state trying to find some of those older varieties that still exist on abandoned homesteads or on the edge of a field, and they're getting those DNA sequenced and trying to revive some of those.
I'd love to get Criterion.
Yeah.
It was so great.
David Benscotter would be the one that would know if anyone has any.
So I know different varieties are used for different things, but my question to you is about the Asian market for apples. If they are the #1 importer of Washington apples, what is their favorite variety, and is it for consumption just out of a grocery store, or is there a larger market for a different kind of apple for other things?
That's a great question. I don't know actually what the top variety export to Asia is right now, but most of the apples we produce are what they call dessert apples, and they're meant to be eaten fresh. So there's not really a market anymore for the baking apples that you used to be able to get, or apples that are good for cider making or other purposes. The focus has been on those fresh dessert apples and that kind of sweet taste that consumers seem to want. Do we have time for one more?
My family and I were traveling over near Fort Hood, and we stopped at a little fruit market there, and I was blown away at how many different apples there were. I never even heard of some of these names. But my question is the Fuji apple, it's kind of a follow-up on the Asian market, is the Fuji apple an import from Japan, or are we selling it to them and naming it Fuji?
The variety came from Japan, and then we started growing them here. So, varieties are developed in many different places. So most of the apples that we've grown commercially in Washington aren't, in fact, developed here. That's why the Cosmic Crisp is so unique, because it was developed specifically for Central Washington and our climate, to be able to withstand the heat and the types of summers we have and everything specific to us. Yeah. Well, thank you all. I'm going to turn the microphone over to Stephanie Barnard here to let her say a few words.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I don't feel like I want to take the stage because it's Amanda's tonight. I think that your presentation was absolutely extremely well done. And I just want to thank the Speakers Bureau. And I know that your presentation was well vetted. I know all of the good work that is being done by Humanities Washington, and just want to thank you for working through them for this type of presentation. Now, I have a couple of questions before I ask you to give her a final applause, but this is something that's funded through Washington State. And there's so many things that we could do with our time. We could have our kids watch a documentary on apples on TV. Why is it, just, we're not going to pass around the microphone, but hands on why this type of Speakers Bureau type presentation is so important for our communities? Any ideas?
It brings our community together.
Thank you. I think that's #1, the best answer, or maybe there's others. Anyone else have any thoughts on that?
Sometimes we aren't even aware of what they're doing at our universities in research or whatever. And this way we get to hear from the people that are actually doing the work. And
Isn't that a lost art? I really do feel like it's a lost art. And we're so much more comfortable just perched in front of our television set doing our learning, when it's so important to get out and to be with people and this community learning that can be done together. I wouldn't have had the same questions as the ones that you raised. I wouldn't have known to ask some of the questions that you asked. I think this is all about community building, and I know I really want to thank Jason and the Riverview, is it SDA, right? The church, because I think this is absolutely critical that we continue this type of work in our communities. And I've been here before, giving a presentation of my own in the other building, but it was years ago before you were the pastor here. But I think that there is a long-standing tradition of community outreach and community work at this church, and I just want to personally thank you. So thank you so much. I was like, why are there not apples up there? What is the deal? Who made that decision? But the grapes were so good. So maybe our next presentation should be about grapes. Anyway, again, a huge round of applause for Amanda. Thank you so much. And it's such an honor to be here with you as a representative in the House of Representatives for the state of Washington. Stephanie Barnard, I live right down the street. If you have anything or you need anything, please reach out to Jason. I can come and answer your questions about what I do in the state legislature. But I believe that these programs are vitally important to community building. And because you're here, you feel the same way. So thanks again for having me. Thanks again for hosting Amanda, and continue the good work that you do. And I will continue to support this program. So thanks so much.
And I think was there one more slide at the end with the QR code? Okay. We really would appreciate your feedback. Washington Humanities uses the feedback from audiences when they're going out and looking for donors and securing grants. So if you would please take a minute to let them know what you thought about tonight's presentation.
Thank you so much. This has been great. I was just wanting to add one little thing, because we do have apples. Oh, sorry. They have been recently added. I made the oversight, and wiser people than me came in and said, "Where are the apples?" Specifically, it was your dad. So we have a couple varieties of apples back there, and some other things. So feel free to hang out. Chat with each other, grab some snacks. Just out of curiosity, should we do this again? Okay. So we've got kind of the idea in place for something that we've recently titled Riverview Forums, where we're going to do community talks like this that aren't specifically religious, but absolutely community building. And so we don't know what the next one's going to be. Maybe on grapes. For grapes. But we really appreciate you coming and starting this off, and we're gonna do some exploring and see what might be. If you homeschool families think that we need to have somebody come and give a lecture on some subject that would be of value and interest to our community, please let me know, and we'll try to work it together. So thank you for coming. Have a good night.
Thank you. Thank you.
I thought it was very interesting, and I know I didn't look like I was doing this.